It's my first visit to Köln. It's my last visit, unfortunately, as a European. We'll see what happens at the end of this month. I have to say that's a matter of sadness, great sadness actually for me. Nonetheless, I'm delighted to be here. I was delighted to be connected with Salomé for this particular event, and thanks to you for agreeing to for agreeing to being part of this. It is an experiment, and I think neither of us have got much of an idea about where it's going to go, but that's exactly how things should be. We have had a chance to exchange a few ideas which I've really valued. So there's a bit of a sense, at least for me, of being already in conversation about the question of silence and silencing and what we hear in silence from our very different positions within the space of sound art and music study. She has already elicited something a bit performative from me and a bit experimental from me, more performative and more experimental than I'm used to doing. So what I propose is a short travel story. It may be a dream. I think it happened very recently. But it concerns my own area of music and sound studies, ethnomusicology, and our subject this evening, the political and social agency of silence and what it does not sound. An aspect of this question, for me at least, is names and naming, hence my subtitle, The Unnamed, evoking unnames and unnaming as well. I've arrived in a strange city, in the dead of night. My cab driver is a taciturn sort, but it seems that he likes to talk about his hunting trips up in the mountains. He tells me he saw a sheepdog being attacked by a lynx, a mountain lion. They're protected by law. I just had to sit and watch, he said. Allah Allah. Around here, I say? No, further up. I name the place, but instantly make a mistake. I use the old name, referring to the site of the 1937-1938 revolt. The massacre of the tribes by the state is as fresh in people's minds as if it had happened a week ago. He corrects me using the modern official name, a touch of irony in his voice. There's a pause. I've heard the legends, I say, weakly. Yes, you'll know about us from the legends, he says, ambiguously, staring out into the dark. And then complete silence for the next 10 minutes or so of our journey. Tanks have crossed the border nearby that same weekend. The state, declaring the need for a cordon sanitaire in an international conflict, is, as everybody knows, still trying to crush what it regards as the descendants of these tribal insurgents. But this is definitely not the moment for idle chatter with a stranger about such matters. When I wake early the next morning, I walk out into a dusty street. Nobody around. Sunshine and a cool, dry autumnal wind. I've been instructed to take breakfast in a roadside cafe since the hotel is just a kind of bunkhouse. Cautious, watchful faces observe me as I do from doorways. I look around. Above me, a road to the citadel, graveyards, a handful of restored buildings, some indecipherable ruins, a few scattered stores and cafes, a street dog with startling blue eyes. Far below me, the new city, a sprawl of concrete around two rather ugly modern mosques. The university, off to my right, is clearly huge. To my left, if I angle my head and squint through folds in topography that I haven't yet quite learned to read, a hint of light blue, the headwaters of a vast hydroelectric dam. It is very quiet. An occasional car or truck grinds up the steep road to the citadel in a cloud of dust. Within minutes, it turns around and returns to the city below. Writing in the late 1940s, the local historian's monumental four-volume history describes the citadel as already a ghost town, already a ruin. Its only conspicuous object, the ancient fort that crowns it. The modern city, too, is a quiet place, no longer sustained by the agricultural land that now lies below the waters of the dam, or by a vibrant and cosmopolitan population which has, for generations now, lived elsewhere. A forgotten place, one might say. But not forgotten by musicians. About 25 years ago, an up-and-coming musician of a kind of cassette and nightclub-based popular music genre told me, "This hybrid thing we call X and worry about so much, you go to my hometown. You'll understand it then." I always remember that, mainly because the singer subsequently became very famous. The folk songs of the area are indeed amongst the most affecting and the best known across the country. The area's vocalists have enjoyed renown since the earliest days of sound recording. Some in the country will know of the complexity of the modal system, a hybrid blend of rural and urban practice, having some kinship with the semi-improvised sweet forms of the neighbouring countries. And some will mention the love of the sound of the clarinet and a kind of banjo, modern instruments regarded as unserious elsewhere, but revered here. None of the musicians seem to be actually here, though. They are either in the metropolis or long dead. Here, nostalgia is the rule. A generation of local musicians is memorised in street names. A generation of musicians is memorised in street names and little shrines in cafes and libraries. But I learned that they were neglected in their time too. The most famous of them all, it seems, died in utter poverty. Attempts to revive it officially in the form of a kind of communal sing-song with an element of moral instruction are spoken about in rather sardonic terms. The neighbouring city, which I note people speak of in rather condescending terms, has marketed its communal singing traditions ferociously, giving visitors something to do in a dry city. If they can, why shouldn't we? If they can, why shouldn't we? Seems to be the reasoning. Old recordings of local artists play in the mainly empty cafes around the citadel, forlornly evoking older and better days. The hydroelectric dam isn't forgotten either. It's one of the modern state's iconic statements of self-sufficiency. It may not have had oil or natural gas, I remember hearing when I first visited the country, but it had water. And in the long term, that would confer the advantage. Water is a nimet, of course, a blessing from God. It makes heaven on earth. The iconography of water tamed and aestheticized is ubiquitous and banal in the country. I genuinely believe it has escaped any kind of comment. Slides in the wrong order here. Local folklore suggests a troubled relationship with water, however, and a forgotten, perhaps even rather fraught dimension of this iconography. I heard almost immediately the following story about one of the local saints. There's a drought. A woman has a dream and consults the local religious authorities. Water must be sprinkled on the head of a corpse. One is located, an anonymous body awaiting burial. The head is somewhere, we presume in the heat of the moment, and somehow separated from the body. Water is sprinkled, and it starts to rain. But now it doesn't stop. Soon the people are praying for the opposite, for the rain to stop. Another dream, reattach the head to the body. A panicked search, but the body is eventually found. It's clear that the dead person was a man of virtue and spiritual power. A shrine is built for him in the citadel. His body doesn't decay. Indeed, it remains intact to the present day, emitting a smell of roses. Here's the second, concerning a local lake. A woman is lost and finds herself in a strange village and asks for water. The villagers ignore her. She collapses, exhausted, and goes to sleep. She wakes up the next day to discover she is on an island. Water has risen around her, drowning the entire village. The island can still be seen today as you look out over the lake on the road east. Some say you can, when the weather is bad and the waters of the lake are churning around, that you can hear church bells ringing under the water. These stories concern primal matters, of course. On the one hand, people or deities that don't listen or that only do so conditionally. In the local languages, in the idioms of the local vocal ideology, a cry of need must be responded to in kind. This is what song is for, and the listener, the person to whom a song is addressed, has significant responsibilities in this regard. A cry demands a cry in return. This is a basic and fundamental condition of social life, of moral community. For Sufis in this part of the world, God gathered mankind at the beginning of time and asked, "Am I not your Lord?" And those gathered answered, "Yes, you are our Lord." The primal spiritual society, the gem, is established in and grounded on this call and response. It is a serious matter, verging on an impossibility, a moral impossibility, not to respond vocally to a cry of pain or need, or water. God might do so for his own purposes, to guide us better, to teach us a lesson or two, but man might not. And these stories concern a fantasy of inundation, of erasing the mistakes of the past, of the virtuous starting afresh. The fantasy of purging, cleansing, starting from scratch has echoed down the ages, from Gilgamesh and Ararat and into the modern state. And the fantasy of the hydraulic potentate, the human would-be master of the power of the flood, is still very much alive, of course. Not without his critics, of course, these days. The scholars say, "You are destroying the past. What will now guide us into the future? How will we answer to future generations for this lost?" The Sultan replies, "The people want better broadband, cheap air travel, tomatoes all the year round. They don't want history anymore." This, I reflect, is a landscape silenced by water. Later, I make a trip to a nearby town to give my new friends a break from me. The castle still hovers above the waters of the dam. The town itself was relocated. The historic mosque was dismantled, numbered stone by numbered stone, and rebuilt way up the hill. Somewhere beneath the waters lie the remains of the church, probably unused at that point. No efforts were made to spare that for posterity. But here's the irony. Orthodox elements, the more wealthy majority, slowly abandoned the town. They had been compensated in cash by the state for their land and immediately squandered it in the metropole's nightclubs, or so I am told. a modern myth perhaps. But the modern town's population now predominantly belongs to the local sect, the local minority sect. Their own place of worship, 100 yards or so away from the mosque, is a smart modern building, home to a large and vibrant community, it seems, including regionally well-known musicians. The mosque, on the other hand, is practically empty. So the dam has not been forgotten. The city and its citadel has also not been forgotten by Armenians. Here was one of the most vibrant Armenian cities, perhaps not the most populous, but 4 out of 18 mahalles were identified as Armenian in the last 19th century censuses. There seems to have been only one major church, which I realised later with a slight sense of shock was now one of the forlorn heaps of masonry near where I had breakfast that morning. Ransacked, I'm told, by treasure hunters in the 1970s. Nothing compared to the huge cathedrals in neighbouring cities, many of which have been renovated in recent decades by a state that has gone to historically puzzling and notorious efforts to deny the genocide. Puzzling because it could easily have put the blame on the Ancien Régime, with which it was, after all, at war at the time. So not an Armenian spiritual centre then, but certainly an intellectual and cultural one. The American missionary colleges here were famed in the region for their excellence as educational centres, including their music education. A generation of musicians disappeared who had learned Western instruments and received a Western musical education, who had played chamber music on piano and violin, and who had formed brass bands. A generation of musicians also deeply knowledgeable in the ways of maqam, the modal, monophonic instrumental and song practices of the metropolitan centres, of not just their own but of neighbouring countries too. Scattered to the far winds, those that survived put this knowledge and expertise to good use, finding common musical cause with other emigres and refugees from these lands, and lively commercial markets to exploit in new cities. Those, the majority population that remained, experienced these deafening musical silences acutely. Efforts to overcome it, to recreate a musical culture, involved negotiating these silences, finding new ways of doing things, new ways of inhabiting the old terms for modes, for genres, new ways of filling the acoustic space, new ways of improvising. They did so in ways that only really made sense to them, and they in turn found it hard to make a home for this music in the new nation state, which had other musical priorities. Hence, what is understood as decline and a defiant compensatory localism. Local collectors and enthusiasts are joining the dots. Every now and again, Armenian musicians in the New World come back, taking advantage of the odd windows of opportunity to put on concerts, make recordings with interested local artists, reassert common musical bonds, find ways of talking about shared culture, knowing that there's precious little else, historical truth and accountability, for instance, that can be meaningfully talked about. The materials at hand with which to think through the situation locally are scarce. The state still labels almost any attempt to do so a crime. Lone assassins can be quickly and easily mobilized against those who step out of line, and nobody will complain much. Thoughtful souls understand this is going to be a very, very long process, and the only possible position in a small provincial city is one of patience. For some, the issues disappear into a mist of historical violence, of conquerors and conquered, vanquishers and vanquished. So many groups in the modern city, other Christians, heterodox Muslims, linguistic minorities of other kinds, have their grievance and grudges, a sense of having been treated badly by history. This semi-forgotten city and its deserted citadel is haunted by silences created by the biopolitical power of the modern state, by histories of genocide, by the religious intensities of frontier zones. In the background lies a fantasy of inundation, of water's cleansing but terrifying power to silence and destroy, even as it establishes the conditions for new life. The fantasy is as primal and as socially and politically untamable as the fantasy of sacrifice itself. Such acts of silencing are a noisy business, of course. The dam has its own intricate soundscape, just as it famously produces its own climatic zone, its own atmosphere. Digital and social media have given a new lease of life to the ancient ethnic hatreds. The state makes its loud utterances from newly tamed universities, press and other public institutions with renewed energy these days. Powerful new sound systems in this city proclaim one faith 5 times a day. To conclude, the question is what we hear in these silences, or rather the sound worlds that have been pushed aside and spoken over. We are used to straining our ears as ethnomusicologists, meaning, of course, nothing as simple as straining to listen to things that are merely quiet or merely in marginal locations. But listening to sound, by contrast, relegated to the status of irrelevancy, listening to sound from which it is assumed we have little or nothing to learn, sound that is not understood to emanate from or fall on the ears of full moral agents, human or otherwise, sound somehow suffocated, not reverberating in a natural acoustic, not reverberating in natural air. Sound in this city is certainly and emphatically idealized as just these things, a source of knowledge, a shaper of moral beings, and, as importantly, a kind of breathing. If it doesn't fulfill these criteria, it will be pushed in the direction of forgetfulness. The latter, sound as breath, has something to do with the problem of water and those with power over it. Not only here, but in other worlds, is a readiness to believe that the watery depths are silent or silencing, and that those who have power over water have the power to silence on a shocking scale. Or it's obverse, the power to make people talk. There's nothing like the fear of drowning to get people to talk, as we learned, to get people to break their silence, as we learned from the waterboarding revelations concerning Iraqi detainees at Abu Ghraib during the US occupation of Iraq. There is no underwater music, no underwater song in the myth of the flood, no whales or dolphins with whom we might strike up mammalian conversation, no sirens to pull us onto the rocks and then under the waves, no underwater cathedrals whose bells might sound in the swirling tides and fill us with guilt and dread. There's a romance, of course, to listening beyond our own atmosphere, to listening beyond the obsessive governance of air and its circulation that marks Western modernity. Long before sound studies, we were, of course, talking to and musicking with whales. We were thrilled by the ambiguous embrace of the sirens. We were haunted by the thought of underwater bells. We have been fascinated, I would say, for a long time by the romance of hearing and even communication with the sound worlds of our atmospheric other. This romance does something to expand, I believe, our capacity to listen for and into silences and to understand what we might come to hear. The waves rise as the planet gets hot, and today's situation, it might be said, requires more than romance. But the options of where to position ourselves as listeners between sound and silence are not always obvious. My own discipline's insistence, for understandable reasons, that we must make the first sound in an ethnographic encounter, that silent listening is now epistemologically suspect, has engaged with one important problem, the problem of neo-colonial ethnography, only to produce another, which I fear is almost as problematic, a de-skilling in quiet listening, in patient and contemplative ethnographic audition, which also surely has a role to play. I feel it has an important role to play in an ethnography capable of engaging with today's sense of crisis, ecological and political. Here's where I think my own thinking and ethnomusicological practice are moving in the same directions as Salomé's projects and her subject today, which I'm looking forward to hearing about right now. I come to a close, though, on a note that disturbs me. Patience and contemplation have their limits in scenes such as the scenes that I've evoked in this traveller's tale, foundational scenes, perhaps, of the environmental catastrophe and of environmental catastrophe and biopolitical violence, the destiny of which can never, it seems, be wrested effectively from the hands of the state. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I too want to thank Eckhart and Marcus for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to be in conversation with Martin. And I too will very much bemoan Brexit. But thankfully I've got a second passport. But it is a tragedy, and I think it has a lot to do with silence and listening and not wanting to hear certain things, not misunderstanding others. And I think sound arts and sound studies is a great place to sort of invigorate what we can hear and what we want to hear and how to hear it. So I'll start. What are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day in attempt to make your own, until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? And of course I am afraid, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. But my daughter, when I told her of our topic and my difficulty with it, said, "Tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent, because there's always that one little piece inside you that wants to be spoken out, and if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter, and if you don't speak it out, one day it will just up and punch you in the mouth from inside." In the cause of silence, each of us draws the face of her own fear of contempt, of censor, of some judgment or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation, but most of all, I think, we fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. What visibility do you fear? From the particular perspective of an African-American woman, who, as she suggests, is at once very visible through the depersonalization of racism as a threat, as the other, and not visible enough as herself in her contingent subjectivity and actions. But she does not claim this fear of visibility for herself or for her race alone, but sees it prevalent more generally and without separation as a fear of being invisible as a woman, who, as she suggests, and I quote, "all share a war against the tyrannies of silence," end of quote. It is the fear of being distorted, misseen, misrepresented, misunderstood, as well as the fear of contempt, criticism, and hate that her visibility might provoke, that silences her. It is this fear of being visible through distorted reflections, she suggests, that make her afraid to become visible. I read this woman not as a physiological binary sex, but as Helen Zixu's woman that is inclusive of a general marginality, a femininity. Zixu suggests, when I say woman, I'm speaking of woman in her inevitable struggle against conventional man. End of quote. Woman in Sixus sense is what is not grasped in discourse and what remains untheorized, and thus it is what has no part in the reality of the philosophical and the political real without being an essentialized other. She is silenced. Woman is the marginal whose own silence sounds her fear of recognition within a depersonalized category of the other, not white man, and it sounds her fear of recognition outside those terms in the contempt and criticism of not being that enough. It is that fear that makes her mute and chokes her, and it is through her own language and through speaking, singing, writing and making noise that she can break the silence and make herself visible by celebrating, naming, singing her distortions as the power of her own form vis-à-vis a normative expectation. The power to become in the freedom of an invisible voice, visible as herself, by calling her distortions herself through her body, singing marginality as the site of her activity and emancipatory force. Guthrie's work provides a soundtrack to this emergent voicing and a courage of singing delicate and discreet silences that make a noise and make a call towards a self-directing form of visibility. Her track, Bellona, from the album Brass Orchids from 2018, sounds the distortion of the visible through the minute, the small, and the abandoned. The girl went to the lavatory, where she could be alone, for she felt quite shaken. She examined herself mechanically in the mirror above her filthy hand basin that was badly cracked and full of hair. The image of her own existence. The dark, tarnished mirror scarcely reflected any image. Perhaps her physical existence had vanished. When she was a little girl, her aunt, in order to frighten her, insisted that the vampire, the one that sucks human blood by biting its victims in the flesh of the neck, casts no reflection in the mirror. She reckoned that it might not be such a bad thing being a vampire, for the blood would add a touch of pink to her solar complexion, for she gave the impression of having no blood unless one day might come when she would have to spill it. Clarice Lispector, The Hour of the Star. Do you feel reflected in the design of the world? Or are you a vampire, monstrous, unrepresentable, and unheard? This monstrous form is the audible of Áine Dwyer's Hounds of Hades from her record Garailles. It is an invisible form that we do not know, and therefore, while we might hear, do not understand. And it heralds the outcome of the story and the future of the girl in Carr's Spectre's The Hour of the Star, foretelling her existence in the image of a cracked mirror, casting no reflection, but producing a monstrous form. Just like the girl's appearance, sound's appearance too is monstrous, vampiric. It casts no reflection in the laboratory mirror, but distorts and changes how we see the world, and how we are seen too. She reckoned that it might not be such a bad thing being a vampire, for the blood would add a touch of pink to her swallow complexion. And sound too would add a touch of pink to the whitewashed walls, using its force of invisibility to change how we see. Sound's voice is invisible, it has no reflection. Instead, it creates a visibility that is not complementary and fulfilling of a visual expectation, but creative of a different way and a different view. It creates from silence its own emergence as noise. In the spectre's story, the lack of reflection, the blood, the vampiric distortions of the girl are her emergence and her entry into the world. It is a moment of silence that gathers up an image of the unseen and creates a preparatory space for its unfolding. In writing is a silent space of producing a different sound. To call yourself, to gain a voice. This silence is not a space left by sound or the opposite of noise. Instead, it is the space at the basis of all sound and containing their potential and possibility. It is the basic chowder from which sound emerges and which all sounds always still contain, as the source of its possibility and as the reminder of its emergence. And it is the invisible place within which we meet ourselves and each other, where I can hear you breathe and where I hear myself. Breathing, humming, murmuring, being. Thus it is where we come to appreciate the fragility of our position and begin to dare to listen to ourselves, to lose the fear of misrepresentation and critique, and come out and speak. Therefore, this silence is the condition of a beginning to speak. It is movement into sounding. It is the space where monsters start to sound. Out of tiny sounds were produced the monstrous as the vampiric, that finds no reflection in the visible, masculine world, but that, in Donna Haraway's sense, creates new patterns that interfere with givens, expectations, and norms. This invisible monster of quiet sounds is not fixed in difference, but showing its effects. It is, to quote Haraway, tropically, for the promises of monsters. The first invites the illusion of essential fixed position, while the second trains us to a more subtle vision. End of quote. Providing another optics to consider the other without looking for a proper reflection, for the same, reproduced, but to embrace what Haraway terms unexpected others. And here there sounds as a new emergent language. And so this more subtle vision sees the girl emerging, gaining with a distorted nose and rosy cheeks the self-assertion and the voice of her own image that queers visual norms. Great screaming. Certain areas of council do nothing. I thought I saw her and followed her through the streets. It wasn't her, of course. I would have done more than that. I would have brought her back to life. Rachel Allen, Kingdom Land, 2019. What are the words you did not have? What would you have liked to say? Sarah Ahmed writes a queer phenomenology. A phenomenology that involves a queer experience and that queers phenomenology. She writes about being in the world as a being orientated in the world, as facing a certain way which just creates our experience of reality. Her key word is orientation. And her central question is, how is it that we come to find our way in a world that acquires new shapes? She connects our being in the world, our listening and seeing in the world, as a being orientated towards the world, which we just see and hear as a result of that orientation. The shape and value things and people have are dependent on how we face them. Whether we hear them or not speaks of our orientation, political, social, sexual, etc. And our orientation articulates our subjectivity, not as a certain identity, but as an orientating being. In relation to this, the apparent inability to hear certain realities presents the strategic deafness and mirrors the desire not to hear political realities and subjectivities. It is a blind spot, or what political scientist Nikita Dhawan calls the privilege of hearing. And I quote, "Hegemonic norms of recognition determine what can be read, heard and understood as intelligible and legible." End of quote. And thus what can make itself count and what by contrast remains silent and or spoken for. For Dhawan, it is the voice of the subaltern femininity that is caught in the crossfire of post-colonial language, and that does not sound her life and reality, and that does not listen for her articulation. She requires a more subtle audition, which listens out for the non-linguistic, the practice of being in sound rather in its linguistic structure and rational infrastructure. To hear the silence speak in her own voice, breaking the privileged status of language as a grammatical structure and orientation, and announcing language silence as a strategy of resistance to being overheard, being heard and interpreted wrongly or ventriloquized and spoken for. This makes the phenomenological orientation a political orientation. The way we orientate our ears and what we orientate them towards is a political position and positioning. We might not notice this orientation, and so we might not notice that what we hear is not the only thing we could hear, but is what we are orientated towards, what we expect, what we desire, what we recognize. These are silent norms that do not ask questions, whose discrepancy and even violence we do not hear. If, however, we disrupt the habitual orientation and listen out for what we do not hear, we can practice listening to silence as an activist listening and hear what is excluded. We can start to hear the monster and appreciate its form. Silence is a strange environment in which we lose our orientation. We lack signposts, habits, a clear voice and reference point. We are lost. But according to Ahmed, getting lost is still getting somewhere. It is getting to new ideas and a new audition, a new orientation and sense of ourselves as a reorienting ourselves in the world. Silence provides us with the possibility, and listening to silence as a listening to that which we do not normally face is a mode of reorientation of our body in the world. to turn another way, to practice a queer listening for what we do not know is there, not to expect to recognize it, no, but to engage in the world, to hear the others speak in their own voice. It provides the possibility of re-inhabiting our own bodies differently and to find different relationships with human and non-human things. Therefore, this is a call to face another way, to give our body a different orientation, to hear silence. And we do not have to call this silence back into the language and lexicon of a normalized orientation, but can work towards an understanding of it in its silence. Does your silence contain the urge to speak and to call yourself? To reorientate our listening and to do so with humility and the readiness to appreciate the inaudible, the silent and the silenced, is a social, political and aesthetic practice and demand that could be worthwhile on any curriculum, from primary school to university and across all disciplines. It would enable us to hear with Ahmed's queer phenomenological orientation, to hear the distortion of this spectre as vampiric, and to also hear the voice of Haraway's monster. Such a sonic sensibility could help us appreciate the silence, the silenced, and the resistance of silence, not to ventriloquize and speak on others' behalf, but to make their knowledge and articulation count in its silence, and to understand and critique the violence of language that demands a structural expression. To instead reach a plural and expansive sense of things in the formless form of silence, even if it means disorientation and getting lost. Sound studies could offer such a realm of experimentation and transportation into the possible worlds of sound, where practice as much as words and silence as much as speech and noise can work towards different understandings of the real, where tacit knowledge and the unheard can unbend normative intelligibility and dominant frames of representation to reach a different knowledge, and one made from the ephemerality of sound and our plural engagement with it. Thus, sound studies can make an important contribution to the decolonialization of language and science, knowledge and disciplines, to the resistance of being orientated one way, by instead engaging in the strange environment of silence and what we do not yet know how to hear and to call. However, contemporary sound studies is on the way towards the non-cochlear, embracing a strategic deafness and a selective hearing, to avoid the unbending of critical language by the unreliable and unstable oozing out of sonic things and practices that do not obey existing taxonomies and the systematic schemata that legitimize scholarly articulation. The sonic territory which emerges out of silence and the sensibility for the self and the other, with that fragile space in walks, is currently being colonized by a visual language that pretends to tend to the audible, but in truth it provides the mute logos of Platonic articulation that knows no breath, no hum, no murmur, no bubble. And it deliberately eschews listening as it might topple the castle of knowledge built on its mute ideologies and histories. I would like us to resist the silencing of the sonic world and sonic work in rational language, or there will be no new rapport with our own silence, no better understanding of the subaltern, and no possibility to hear the beauty of the monstrous or the vampiric. We need to listen, to truly listen without prejudice. We need to appreciate the legitimacy and urgency of listening as a leaning into the audible and towards the inaudible, without the safety net of rational sense on the pre-given orientation. but was the desire and confidence to exist happily in the disorientation of a silent sound. Monstrous horses. I jumped, I lit them loose, on fire, a great lemon, in place of my heart, a start. I'm falling without help down a steep, white cliff, saluting magpies in hope. I passed two horses, stood end to end, making one monstrous double horse. Off in the distance, I noticed with a start a horizon line of suns, hammering chalk. The first beneath them is so green, it is an optical illusion, mounted on foam. Rachel Allen, Kingdom Land. Thank you.